Today in The Global African, we'll talk about Hillary Clinton's announcement, the Summit of the Americas, and National Poetry Month. That's Today in The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher. Thanks, and don't go anywhere. April marks National Poetry Month, a month dedicated to both the discovery and the rediscovery of poetry, as well as poets themselves. To commemorate this, we're going to speak to some poets and get their thoughts on the importance of poetry being taught in the classroom, political consciousness in poetry, and how art shapes and develops social movements. We're joined for this segment by Charneice Fox Richardson, Patrick Washington, and Tony Medina. Charneice Fox Richardson is an award-winning producer, director, writer for stage and screen, published poet, and a children's author. Also joining us is Patrick Washington, who's a Def Jam poet, activist, and teacher. And finally, Dr. Tony Medina is a professor of creative writing at Howard University. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I want to look at poetry in this particular moment, the Black Lives Matter moment. And I want to look at poetry not in the abstract, but in connection to social movements. What's the connection? Is it emerging? Is it evolving in this moment, or what?
So it's interesting. I produce a show called Speak Out, and it's a poetry slam for young children. And one of the poets has a poem where in the chorus, and we just edited the promo, so I know it. And he says, "I got a target on my body, somebody, please protect me."
I got a target on my body, somebody. Please protect me, got a target on my body, somebody.
And so I feel like that poem is directly coming from this whole Black Lives Matter movement. And so I think it's really interesting to see young people using the art form that came from the last poets and Gil Scott-Heron and being able to speak to what they see happening in their communities now. So, I mean, they're just basically passing the torch, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Dr. Medina, what's the relationship in your mind between what we see right now and, let's say, the Black Arts movement of the 60s?
It's a direct link to the Black Arts movement, and there's generational links that are always happening. First, you got to go, in terms of social movements in this country, you got to go with black folks, and black folks using poetry to take a stand. You got to go to Harlem Renaissance, period. Mm-hmm. That links right into the Black Arts movement. That comes up to mid-'80s, late '80s, where the whole spoken word movement is starting to develop and reemerge itself. Then you come to this period right now with the Black Lives Matter, and what the Black Lives Matter movement is doing is forcing a lot of the academic poets, those MFA types that are forced to come out and really take a stand, where a lot of times those programs are telling folks, that poetry is supposed to be for art's sake, but not for the people. So we're getting back to the relevancy of the Black Arts movement, also linked to the movements that have taken place in Latin America, in Africa, in the Caribbean. I mean, the Nicaraguans used to have a saying that, poetry, everybody's born a poet. It's society that takes it away from us, and it's our job to take it back. So, Neruda was a poet who became elected as vice president of Chile, and he was assassinated, by the CIA and Nixon administration, along with Allende back in '73. So, they see poetry as a threat in Central America and Latin America, as well as in this country.
And this may sound like a very strange and perhaps naive question. Where do people learn poetry these days? And let me explain what I mean. We're witnessing an erosion of education. Many of the programs that existed when I was in elementary and high school are gone. Programs in many colleges where the whole idea of spending time on literature and the arts has been denigrated. Yet poets are being produced. So where are they coming from?
There are so many teaching artists who are poets and writers and creative artists who want to see young people doing something spectacular with the arts. And so there's so many amazing after-school programs that happen, and that's most of the poets that I've ever met, they didn't get it in school, they got it after school. So that's where we're creating these young artists that also are becoming activists too.
Mm-hmm. I would also say that for better or for worse, the internet The kids are very visual, and they will, go to YouTube and pull up their favorite poet, and watch it, learn their movements, their mannerisms. A lot of times, kids will come to me like, "Oh, I'm a poet," and then they'll perform like Tony Medina, or they'll read like, somebody that they saw, on the internet. So it's a shaky starting point, but it's a starting point, and we go from there.
But the first thing is that people are born artists. They're born to be, what hopefully they become. So poetry is something that people are born with. Kids are always attracted to language. That's why hip hop is so popular. That's why rap music is so popular, because kids are generally attracted to language, particularly rhyme and things like that. So they're born with it. They do it. They express themselves in a myriad of ways, either orally, where the tradition comes from, or writing. And they also see people like, the Deaf Poetry Show. That influenced a lot of younger generation people into poetry, going to see poets in performance. And like Charneice was saying, in the schools where we have nonprofit programs that are, always struggling to get money and stuff, but they put poets in the schools to influence our kids, even though more and more the government doesn't seem to think that humanities is important,
One of the questions that has rolled around in my head for a while is the relationship between poetry and activism. That there are many people, I started to feel in the 90s at least, and early 2000s, who seem to identify their poetry as their activism. And so their relationship to change was through poetry, but not through activism. I'm just wondering how you look at the issue of poetry, activism, and social change.
Yeah, there has to be an action behind that. I mean, one of the things, as a teaching artist that works with young people, when we talk about movements, a lot of the kids that I work with write poetry, and we teach poetry, but we also teach the importance of activism. So like when Jenna 6 happened, I took a group of kids in a bus to Jenna because I wanted them to understand what a movement looked like. What did it look like when thousands of people came together for this one particular reason to protest? So I think that, when we talk about movements, it's important to give kids or young people like the actual tools, but then to take them to actually see and appreciate what people are doing. So if you want to hashtag Black Lives Matter, that's great, but did you go to Ferguson? What did you do? What are you doing in your community that really makes a difference? Even if you can't make it to Ferguson, what are you doing in your community to create change?
We're honored to have the two of you perform two poems. And I don't know that there was a flip of the coin to determine who would go first.
I'll go first.
All right, great.
This is a segment of a poem. It's kind of a love letter to where I came from and what made me as an artist. And it's for U Street. I walked in on your ashes. Plastic tops underfoot popping off like gum and Shorty's mouth bedazzled, blinged out with crushed glass, sprinkled across her face like glitter on a weary stripper. Your last breakup tore you apart. When Martin was shot, you got naked, doused yourself with whatever you could find, scrawled black owned across your torso and sat in a corner for 18 years. From Georgia to 14th Street, you were unrecognizably beautiful and on crack. Still, U Street swung back like her blues were never sad. Cooler, cerulean human beings showed up, took you by jagged fingers and spun you in the twilight until the curse fell off. These bright people sung like hummingbirds, moved like incense smoke, and smelt like chicken, so they made good companions. Taught you to be bilingual. You could speak the language of the marketplace in one breath and get gutter like a mother in the next. Our first date, sound check was the destination. Lyrical witch doctors concocted detonations with the skin of an amphibian, the fur of a lion, a black rooster's feathers, and a little baking soda. We talk voodoo, and it was all for you.
Nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Medina.
Well, I just learned that this show is broadcast into Venezuela. So 10 years ago, I wrote a poem called Poem for Hugo Chavez.
Ah.
So I guess I'll do that for my Venezuelan
That's right.
people.
Rock and roll.
Poem for Hugo Chavez. Because you know that pain is not our motherland, that suffering is not our divine right, that heaven is what we make on earth, like houses, love, and bread. Because you come from the heart of the soil and do not sprinkle us with holy water, pie in the sky lies and ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Because you know that your big mouth and your curly hair is African, and your brown skin and dark eyes is Indian. Because you don't point to Europe for beauty or salvation. Because you know, as Che and Fidel and Maurice Bishop and Roque Dalton and Walter Rodney and Neruda and Allende and Patrice Lumumba, that life is what we make with our hands. Because you know, as Jesus, that it is not difficult to multiply bread and fish, that oil is not the lifeblood of the earth, that it should not run through our veins like fear. Because you are David in the shadow of Goliath, and know that the price of freedom is love.
Thank you both very much. Thank all three of you for joining us for the Global African.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been an
Appreciate
honor. Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for joining us for this segment of the Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher, and we'll be back in a moment. President Obama shook hands with Cuban President Raul Castro at the 7th Summit of the Americas, a symbolic step in the normalization of relations between the two nations. This is the first year Cuba has been allowed participation at the summit, which took place in Panama City. Obama received praise for his pledge to remove Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list. However, many Latin American leaders decried Obama's actions towards Venezuela, including the recent executive order that declared the state a national security threat and authorized sanctions against 7 top Venezuelan officials. We're joined with Professor Gerald Horne, who is the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. Professor Horne, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
Our pleasure. So, wanted to talk about the Summit of the Americas, and the two things actually. One is the change in U.S.-Cuba relations, the meeting between President Castro and President Obama, but also the issue of Venezuela and how that was handled at the summit.
Well, with regard to your first point, the December 2014 attempt by the U.S. administration to normalize relations with Cuba was welcome. It helped to simplify matters for President Obama at the Panama summit. However, I think we need to understand a few things. Number one, that this effort to normalize relations is in some ways, as President Obama has hinted himself, an attempt to destabilize Cuba through other means. That is to say, the overt means of bludgeoning has not worked. And so now a softer approach will work. That is to say, flooding the island with capital, which presumably from the U.S. point of view will exacerbate class tensions and racial tensions. And from the U.S. point of view will hopefully weaken the administration of the Castro regime. As we speak, Russian-U.S. relations are at a real low. We have all heard these reports about Russian submarines supposedly sailing off the coast of the Gulf of Mexico and Russian bomber planes supposedly off the coast of California. We also know that China is the new bugaboo of U.S. foreign policy with Obama's pivot to Asia, and China has been pouring money into Cuba, just as it's been pouring capital into the Bahamas off the southern tip of Florida, and of course into Jamaica and the other Caribbean islands as well. And so in order to get U.S. national security on a firmer footing, the decision was made in Washington to try to normalize relations with Havana so as to forestall the possibility that perhaps in a future crisis, Cuba would reappear as it did in October 1962. That is, as a so-called launching pad for supposed attacks against the United States of America.
Did you find it contradictory in any ways that at the same time that the U.S. was improving relations with Cuba, that it was worsening relations with Venezuela?
Well, obviously there's a contradiction there. A lot of it has to do with oil politics. That is to say that Venezuela, as a major oil exporter, has had troubled relations with Washington and with oil giants in the United States of America, including ExxonMobil. And as a state oil company, that is to say in Venezuela, that is not seen as the appropriate model of development for a South American nation, or any nation for that matter. So it's somewhat inevitable that relations between Caracas and Washington would go into a downturn. I was heartened to see that President Maduro of Venezuela was able to collect millions of signatures of Venezuelan nationals protesting against this allegation that supposedly Venezuela is a threat to the national security of the United States of America. I'm also heartened to see that Venezuela's neighbors are standing in solidarity with Caracas. Hopefully there will be sufficient pushback to get Washington to change his mind.
Where do we go from here in the relationship between this changing Latin America? We've seen the rise of left-leaning or explicitly leftist governments in several countries in Latin America. The U.S. seems to be particularly isolated in its relationship to Latin America. What do you, when you speculate over the coming period of years, what do you see as a trajectory?
Well, it's hard to say. As we know, there's a very powerful right-wing faction in the U.S. ruling elite of the United States of America. They've just disrupted, perhaps temporarily, perhaps permanently, the nuclear negotiations with Iran. And that may be auguring a similar kind of disruption with regard to U.S. Latin American relations. That is to say, as the more realistic wing of the U.S. ruling elite, now led by President Obama, moves in one direction, his chain is yanked in the other direction.
Dr. Gerald Horne, thank you very, very much for joining us in The Global African.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us for this segment of The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher, and stay tuned. We'll be right back. Hillary Clinton recently announced that she would be running for President of the United States. She is anticipated to be the front-runner nominee for the Democratic Party nomination in the 2016 presidential race. What is not being discussed by the media is the impact of the large stream of corporate funds Clinton has been receiving. Tech firms, Wall Street, as well as defense contractors are lining up to financially support her campaign. What does this mean for a Clinton presidency? To address the perception that she is an entrenched Washington insider, Clinton appears to be utilizing populist appeals for equality and justice on a campaign. Politico recently reported that donors are not concerned about her populist tone, chalking it up to pure campaign rhetoric. What does her candidacy tell us about the state of the Democratic Party today, as well as our national politics? We're joined by Dr. Julianne Malveaux, former president of Bennett College, serves on the board of the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., and also the Recreation Wish List Committee of Washington, D.C., is a noted author, many media appearances, great commentator. Thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
So Hillary Clinton announced, and
you're surprised?
No, I wasn't quite surprised, but what I was surprised by was the nature of her announcement, that she tacked to the left. I'm not saying that she was left, but her announcement was definitely playing on populist themes. Mm-hmm. And I don't think of the Clintons as populists.
They were still playing some of those tapes from 91, 92 with the Stand By Your Man, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So she's got to figure out how to package it differently. So I think the low-key, announcement with the sort of kumbaya cast of characters, showing her basic interest in diversity, which isn't new, but the way that she announced, the low-key way, was new. And I think the use of populist themes, that's the Warren in her. People are still waiting for Elizabeth Warren. She said she's not running, but there are still several PACs out there who are either pushing her, attempting to raise money for her, doing other things. They may not be PACs, but unofficial organizations. I get an email probably 2 or 3 times a day about something related to Elizabeth Warren.
Right.
So I think that Hillary is trying to co-opt some of those themes, which I think is not a bad idea. She had been so center heretofore that is what sparked the notion that Warren should run. I think that's what's got Martin O'Malley interested, is that there's some points that she isn't touching. Now, frankly, Warren probably would have a better chance of shaking her up than O'Malley would, but given the numbers, I don't think either of them, neither of them has a chance of derailing her. But it would have been interesting, and we'll still see if there's going to be some stiff conversation, not competition, but at least conversation. I mean, she shouldn't have a cakewalk, but she probably will.
It feels that way. I mean, I don't get the sense, even though former Governor O'Malley has, essentially made noises about running, I don't think Elizabeth Warren's going to run. The question I have is whether Senator Bernie Sanders is going to run, and whether he would run as a Democrat or whether he'd run as an independent, and whether he could galvanize anybody or whether it would effectively be a symbolic campaign.
We've seen those symbolic campaigns before. I mean, we think about Ralph Nader,
Right.
Running against the establishment, running to the left of the establishment, getting 2% of the vote, which makes a statement, but what statement does it make? I think for many of the old Naderites, at some point you get pragmatic. You get to a certain point and you say, okay, I'm going to make a point, but is this point going to elect Marco Rubio or somebody like that? And then back to the Democrats. So it would be useful if he ran as a Democrat in the primary, because that's when he would have the most opportunity to influence the platform.
Well, that actually raises this big strategic question I've been mulling over a lot, particularly since the November 2014 election. We spend a great deal of time, progressives, focusing on presidential elections. Much of the right wing has spent a lot of time over the last 40 years on local elections and state elections, and they've been building up slowly their control of different states. And I don't see a corresponding state strategy among progressives.
What you see with the Republicans is a fairly thick bench. That's a result, although they're all kind of interesting, but as a result of them having done some of the state work. You've got states like California where it would make a difference. And I do think good things are going to come out of California with the possibility of Kamala Harris and what we'll see with the governor's race, because Jerry Brown won't be running again. Right. But in all of the, there are many states. Ohio is another state. We had a great woman, African-American woman, Nina Turner, who was running for Secretary of State. And she was in the state Senate, so she ended up losing her Senate seat in order to run for Secretary of State. She didn't come close, but she did very respectably, over 30, pushing toward 40% of the vote. So but that's the kind of person that needs to be surrounded and pushed through the next electoral cycle so that she could run for something else. She could run again for Secretary of State, something like that. You just don't see that much coordination. And I think that one of the things has been that the left has been used to letting the Democratic Party lead the way in terms of things like candidate training and candidate organization. It'd be really useful to see organizations such as Rainbow, although it can't really do politics, but at Rainbow Arm, maybe Citizens Education Fund, the C3 that does do education. Organizations maybe like Al Sharpton's NAN, maybe some of the unions and some others, to talk about what kind of candidate recruitment and training they could do on a state. And it doesn't even have to be state by state. You could look at certain congressional, senatorial, and legislative districts. Because you look at a state like North Carolina, which is, I mean, the Republicans have taken it over so amazingly that the violations to constitutional and human rights are just replete. That's right. And there are opportunities, even still within that state, to look at new leadership and new possibilities.
Dr. Julianne Malveaux, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us for this episode of The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher, and we'll see you next time.